August 19, 1944. In a bunker deep inside East Prussia, German General Alfred Jodl pored over maps and supply tables. His staff drew neat lines showing how far American spearheads stretched from the Normandy beaches, 400 miles and counting. They calculated that each armored division guzzled 150,000 gallons of gasoline per day. There was simply no way, the German planners believed, that the Americans could keep their tanks moving 125 miles a day while dragging fuel, ammunition, and food across destroyed French roads. It was a simple equation. When your columns outrun their railheads, the offensive stops. Yet the soldiers racing through France were not following the equations of German war colleges. They were following the roaring rumble of engines on a highway unlike anything Europe had seen. From the moment Allied armies broke out of the bocage at Saint-Lô, consumption skyrocketed. General Eisenhower's 36 divisions required about 20,000 tons of supplies every day. Patton's Third Army and Hodges' First Army alone burned through roughly 800,000 gallons of fuel daily. Ammunition, rations, spare parts, even socks and soap had to travel from beaches where they piled up in Normandy to depots hundreds of miles away. The French rail system lay in ruins from Allied bombing and German sabotage, and major ports remained in enemy hands. Without a solution, the great dash across France would grind to a halt. In August 1944, Logistics Chief Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee ordered a radical improvisation. A dedicated truck highway that would run one way to the front and back on another route. Within 36 hours, staff officers cobbled together a plan and borrowed the name from railroad slang, the Red Ball Express. On August 25th, the first convoy rolled out of Saint-Lô with 3,858 trucks carrying 4,482 tons of supplies. Within 4 days, the operation expanded to 132 truck companies with 5,958 vehicles, moving more than 12,000 tons of supplies. To make this possible, the Army mobilized 23,000 drivers and mechanics, 3/4 of them African American. They assembled over 6,000 trucks, tankers, and jeeps and painted the route with red balls on signposts to mark the one-way corridors. Military police stationed along the road enforced strict rules, maintain 60-yard spacing, no passing, obey the 25-mile-per-hour speed limit, and stop for only 10 minutes every 2 hours. Drivers learned to navigate by tiny blackout lights called cat eyes that cast a dim beam onto the pavement. Headlights were forbidden near the front for fear of snipers and Luftwaffe strafers. The route itself looped about 300 miles outbound and inbound, and civilian traffic was banned to keep convoys rolling. What made the Red Ball Express unprecedented was its sheer scale and tempo. On a typical day, 899 trucks were on the road, departing depots every 5 minutes around the clock. The convoys ran 20 hours per day and consumed over 300,000 gallons of gasoline on their own. In just the first week, the Red Ball moved 82,000 tons of supplies between August 25 and September 2nd. Between August 29 and September 15th, some 6,000 trucks carried 135,000 tons of material on 2 highways from Saint-Lô to Chartres. Overall, by the time the operation ended on November 16th after 82 days, Red Ball drivers had delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. As many as 140 truck companies were assigned to the route, and most were segregated African American units. The convoys hauled everything from gasoline and ammunition to Bailey Bridge sections, flour, potatoes, and candy. When divisional commanders needed replacement soldiers, nurses, or tank parts in a hurry, they threw them onto a Red Ball truck. By the rules, a truck that broke down had to pull out of line, attempt repairs, and wait for an ordnance crew. It was not expected to catch up. Mechanics worked miracles in mud and rain, cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles and improvising repairs to keep the column moving. Fatigue was relentless. Many drivers averaged 36 hours behind the wheel without sleep, splashing water on their faces to stay awake. The Red Ball Express belonged disproportionately to black soldiers. In a segregated army that barred them from most combat roles, 73% of truck companies were African American. They seized the chance to prove themselves. Truckers gave their vehicles names like Miss Anne, Sweet Clara, and Justine. They blasted jazz from the radios, painted slogans on bumpers, and raced to their own daring rhythm. Stars and Stripes reported that drivers worked 20 hours a day, and when their trucks zigzagged from exhaustion, they would throw water on their faces and drive on. These men faced dangers beyond fatigue. Enemy snipers lurked near forests. Luftwaffe fighter planes strafed convoys. V-1 and V-2 rockets occasionally hit the road. A rocket once struck an ammunition truck, killing 6 drivers instantly. Others died when their vehicles overturned on narrow village streets or skidded off rain-slicked bridges. For black drivers, recognition was rare. They endured racism from white officers and from some French civilians who expected the American liberators to be white. They ate in segregated mess lines and slept in separate bivouacs. Yet their performance forced a re-evaluation. Former Private Ernest Myers recalled, "We wanted to show that black men were combat ready. We wanted to make an impression for the people back home." Their success fed into post-war arguments for desegregation, making the Red Ball Express a quiet but profound milestone in civil rights. While the Americans improvised highways, their enemy's supply system still clanked to a 19th century rhythm. On the Eastern Front, horses pulled two-thirds of German vehicles and provided 80% of the army's motive power. Even in France, fuel shortages and the destruction of railroads forced the Wehrmacht to hitch artillery and supply wagons to teams of horses. Hitler dreamed of a mechanized blitzkrieg, but the Reich never produced enough trucks and tractors. One German soldier recalled his division returning from the Eastern Front in 1944 and finding itself again reliant on horses to haul guns and equipment. The contrast between endless American convoys and exhausted horse teams staggering through mud astonished many Germans. As one captured officer reportedly sighed, "We were defeated by your trucks, not your tanks." Fuel was the lifeblood of the Allied advance. To reduce dependence on tankers and trucks, engineers masterminded Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Using specially designed 3-inch flexible lead pipes and enormous floating conundrums, British and American crews laid 17 pipelines across the English Channel. By March 1945, these lines pumped 1 million gallons of fuel per day to Allied depots in France. General Eisenhower called Pluto second in daring only to the Mulberry harbors because the pipelines snaked along the seafloor through treacherous currents. The combination of Pluto and the Red Ball Express meant that frontline fuel dumps never ran dry, even when weather-grounded aircraft or roads turned to quagmire. The Red Ball Express was not perfect. Accidents, breakdowns, and traffic jams multiplied as the convoy extended deeper into France. When the main route could no longer handle the volume, commanders designated parallel secondary roads and gave them names like White Ball, Green Diamond, and Brown Line. They established forward transfer points near Soissons and Sommesous, where supplies were offloaded to smaller convoys bound for corps and divisions. To shorten hauling distances, engineers built bypasses and 40 bridges, opened 15 fuel depots, and set up 26 maintenance stations along the highway. Mobile ordnance crews patrolled the roads to repair disabled vehicles. Salvage details retrieved wrecks for spare parts. Quartermaster units set up field kitchens and bivouacs at predetermined mile markers. When road congestion threatened collapse, the Air Transport Command helped by flying 900 C-47 sorties a day, delivering 2,700 tons of supplies from England and Cherbourg to forward airstrips. Together, the trucks and aircraft created a supply network that, in the words of one French farmer, made France a great machine whose wheels never stopped. By the second week of September, the Red Ball Express was delivering more than 12,000 tons per day, almost as much as an entire field army consumed. The average delivery climbed to 12,848 tons per day by the end of August, and 89,939 tons were hauled in the first week alone. When the operation closed on November 16th, the tally stood at 412,193 tons, equivalent to about 22 million ton-miles of freight. The convoys burned an estimated 300,000 gallons of fuel daily, wore out thousands of tires, and logged more than 10 million miles on their odometers. Maintenance reports show that as many as 1,800 trucks were sidelined each day for repairs and cannibalization, and over 5,000 trucks were ultimately destroyed or scrapped, yet fresh vehicles from US factories replaced them almost as fast. Despite these costs, the benefits were monumental. By keeping Patton and Hodges supplied, the Red Ball enabled the liberation of Paris, the capture of more than 400,000 German troops, and a war shortened by several months. At its peak, the system's 23,000 drivers operated around the clock with two-man crews, making 54-hour round trips at speeds sometimes exceeding 60 miles per hour, far above the official 25 mph limit. Their convoys became so notorious that British soldiers joked they would climb trees when they heard a Red Ball truck approaching, and French villagers learned to scatter as the jimmies thundered through. The psychological impact of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond tonnage. German intelligence officers initially dismissed the convoys as reckless until reconnaissance pilots reported streams of headlights stretching to the horizon. An astonished Wehrmacht officer later wrote that he watched trucks spaced at 30-second intervals pass a single point for 8 hours straight. To civilians in occupied France, the flood of supplies signaled that liberation was not only inevitable, but inexorable. French resistance fighters used the sight of endless convoys to recruit volunteers, and some historians believe the sheer demonstration of abundance convinced wavering collaborators to switch sides. Even some German soldiers were demoralized. Captured prisoners told their interrogators that they could not hope to match an enemy that could waste fuel by running convoys with headlights at night. The roar of deuce and a halves became as potent a weapon as any artillery barrage, broadcasting the industrial might of the United States into the fields and villages of France. When the Red Ball Express finally shut down, it left behind more than torn-up roads and worn-out trucks. It proved that African-American soldiers could perform critical missions under pressure, helping to erode the myths used to justify segregation. Many black veterans returned home determined to fight for full civil rights after driving supplies through France. Their success contributed to President Truman's decision to desegregate the armed forces in 1948 and provided a generation of leaders for the civil rights movement. On the logistical side, the experience shaped careers. Hundreds of Red Ball drivers became entrepreneurs, founding trucking companies and lobbying for better highways. General Eisenhower later credited the Red Ball Express with inspiring the interstate highway system. If a nation could build a cross-country truck network under fire, why not in peacetime? The operation also highlighted the centrality of supply chains to modern warfare, a lesson the US Army would take to Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. All told, the Red Ball Express cost about $100 million, a bargain when compared to the strategic gains. It helped capture Paris weeks earlier than expected, prevented German forces from establishing a coherent defensive line, and saved untold Allied lives. Historians argue that without the Red Ball, the Battle of the Bulge might have turned out differently. The logistics lifeline kept Patton's divisions moving fast enough to relieve besieged troops in Belgium. The convoys also served as a testbed for innovations that would become standard in military trucking: one-way roads, convoy discipline, mobile repair depots, and modular packaging of supplies. Many of the young men who drove Jimmies would go on to design or build the post-war highway network that binds the United States today. Even in popular culture, the legend of the Red Ball Express lived on. The term was revived for supply lines in Korea and appears in films, novels, and television shows. As we recount the achievements of the Red Ball Express, it is tempting to focus on numbers: 23,000 drivers, 6,000 trucks, 412,193 tons. But behind the figures were young men, many of them barely 20, who worked until their hands blistered and their eyes reddened. They proved that logistics could be as decisive as strategy, that a truck driver could change the course of a war. They forced German generals to confront the limits of their own assumptions and gave French civilians a glimpse of a future defined by abundance rather than scarcity. They demonstrated that the promise of democracy includes not only freedom, but the capacity to deliver food, fuel, and medicine at scale. Today, as militaries and nations once again debate the balance between flashy weapons and unglamorous supply chains, the Red Ball Express offers a cautionary tale. Could we replicate such a feat if challenged? Would we muster the political will to mobilize thousands of drivers and maintain thousands of trucks for weeks on end? How will we ensure that the people who keep the machines running, often women, minorities, and immigrants, receive recognition equal to frontline fighters? The men of the Red Ball Express did not set out to make history. They set out to deliver gas cans and ammunition cases. In doing so, they helped liberate a continent, hasten the collapse of fascism, and laid the foundations for the modern logistics revolution. Remembering them is more than nostalgia. It is a reminder that endurance, improvisation, and inclusivity are as vital to national strength as any weapon. The speed with which the Red Ball was created was itself a marvel. In mid-August, the services of supply had no specific plan for pursuing armies beyond Normandy. Supplies piled up on the beaches and in hedgerow villages because railroads were smashed and their rolling stock destroyed. Staff officers at headquarters turned to a handful of logistics veterans who had cut their teeth in North Africa and Sicily. Over coffee and cigarettes, they sketched a solution on scrap maps. Build a highway solely for supply trucks, strip civilian traffic off it, and mark it so clearly that even a 20-year-old who had never been to France could drive it half asleep. They borrowed a symbol from American railroads, a red circle that meant priority freight. Red circles were painted on directional signs, stenciled on bumpers, and hammered onto trees at crossroads. Within 36 hours, hundreds of carpenters and sign painters converted a patchwork of French farm roads into a coherent route, complete with mileposts, fueling points, and bivouac areas. They persuaded French authorities to clear all civilian vehicles off the designated lanes and assigned military police to enforce the ban. Those same MPs coined the nickname for John Lee. They called him Jesus Christ himself because when he issued an order, the seas of trucks literally opened before him. No Allied plan since Operation Overlord had been written so quickly and implemented so efficiently. In effect, the Red Ball Express was a demonstration that the cumbersome US Army could turn agile when necessity commanded it. Life on the Red Ball Highway developed its own culture. The convoys operated like clockwork. Trucks rolled every 5 minutes in groups of 200, each group identified by a number chalked on a board at the tailgate. Drivers knew the next fuel point, mess stop, and bivouac area by heart. If a truck missed its scheduled interval, it had to wait for another convoy with similar cargo. Discipline was strict. Convoys were to maintain a 60-yard gap between vehicles. Passing was forbidden because head-on collisions could block the road for hours. Speed limit signs posted every few miles reminded drivers of the 25 mph cap, but in practice many removed the governors under their carburetors and raced at 40 or 50 mph to finish early. MPs attempted to enforce the limit, but there were too few police for hundreds of miles of highway. When British lorry drivers saw an American deuce and a half bearing down on them, they joked about climbing trees. French villagers called the Americans cowboys and stood in doorways waving as trucks roared through. The convoys carried everything: artillery shells neatly stacked and lashed down, crates of spam, barrels of oil, jerry cans of fuel, hospital cots, even circus lions destined for a morale show. To relieve monotony, drivers decorated dashboards with pin-up pictures and good luck charms. Some convoys were accompanied by jeeps carrying three-person jeep shows, small bands with generators, loudspeakers, and guitars that would pull off into rest areas and perform for the truckers during the 10-minute breaks. Red Ball duty was arduous and unromantic, but it created a camaraderie that many veterans later compared to that of bomber crews or infantry platoons. Keeping thousands of jimmies rolling across rutted farm roads required ingenuity worthy of a frontline workshop. Tires were in chronic short supply. Drivers swapped worn tires between trucks at rest stops and patched inner tubes with rubber from fuel hoses. Axles cracked, gearboxes seized, and engines burned oil under heavy loads. Mechanics cannibalized engines from wrecked vehicles at the roadside, sometimes performing engine swaps under shell fire. Each convoy included an ordnance truck loaded with spare parts, tools, and a welding set. When a truck broke down, the driver would pull to the shoulder, pop the hood, and wait for the ordnance crew, who might be hours behind in the next convoy. Reports indicated that as many as 30% of Red Ball vehicles were deadlined, taken out of service, on any given day for repairs. Army depots in England and Normandy shipped thousands of replacement engines and transmissions to keep pace with attrition. The Army built 26 permanent maintenance stations along the route where teams could jack up trucks, change wheels, and patch radiators. For major rebuilds, wreckers hauled disabled vehicles back to base camps. Salvage crews stripped them to bones and sent usable parts forward. Long-term wear measured in miles was savage. A deuce and a half might be rated for 10,000 miles of service in peacetime, but on the Red Ball, it often reached that figure in 2 months. Drivers wrote home that they felt like participants in some gigantic endurance test, measuring success not by battles won, but by engines rebuilt under the stars. Even the enemy took notice. German prisoners captured after the liberation of Paris spoke in awe of the convoy lights they had seen from their foxholes. "For hours the horizon glowed with your lights," confessed one captured lieutenant. "We thought you crazy to waste gasoline. Then we realized you could afford such extravagance. You were sending us a message." Another officer wrote in his diary, later seized by Allied intelligence, that the rhythm of American trucks kept him awake at night. "They came every minute loaded with more ammunition and fuel. For us, there was no hope of equal supply. We were beaten not by your divisions, but by your trucks." Such admissions shocked some Allied commanders who still doubted the importance of logistics. The Red Ball Express persuaded them that a modern army's strength lay as much in supply columns as in armored columns. As autumn turned to winter and rains soaked the French countryside, the Red Ball faced its greatest test. Mud churned up by thousands of wheels turned sections of the highway into quagmires. Drivers chained up tires and plowed through axle-deep ruts, spraying muck over hedgerows. Frost slicked bridges, causing trucks to slide sideways on planks. Fog reduced visibility to yards. Yet the convoys did not stop. Engineers laid pierced steel planking over marshy stretches, while ordnance crews added winches to trucks to pull each other out of ditches. The arrival of autumn also coincided with the restoration of rail lines and the opening of ports like Antwerp, gradually reducing dependence on truck convoys. On November 16th, the Red Ball Express officially shut down. Some trucks continued to run supplies on other designated routes, but the legend had served its purpose. The costs of the Red Ball Express were staggering but necessary. Drivers risked their lives and wore out their bodies to keep steel moving forward. The operation consumed vast amounts of petroleum, hundreds of thousands of gallons daily, to hold the very fuel and munitions that tanks required. Thousands of trucks were destroyed, scrapped, or cannibalized, representing a significant financial investment. Yet, when economists later estimated that the operation cost around 100 million, analysts concluded it was a bargain. That expenditure sped up the collapse of German resistance, shortened the war by months, and saved countless lives on both sides. The true measure of value lay not in dollars, but in momentum and morale. The Red Ball Express kept advancing armies supplied at the critical moment when speed counted most. Context is critical to understanding the Red Ball Express. Many historians note that Allied strategy in 1944 was a race between supply and German recovery. Hitler hoped that if his armies could hold until winter, rain and snow would bog down the Allies and give V-2 rockets and new jet fighters time to change the balance. The Red Ball helped close the door on that hope. By delivering fuel and ammunition fast enough to maintain the pursuit, it denied the Wehrmacht breathing space. It also forced the Germans to commit scarce Luftwaffe resources to attacking convoys rather than frontline units, further weakening their defenses. Some critics argue that the Red Ball consumed too much fuel and manpower that could have been used elsewhere. Others point out that rail lines were restored by October and that truck convoys could not be sustained indefinitely. Both views are true, yet those considerations miss the key point. Logistics is about timing. The Red Ball Express existed to fill a gap at a decisive moment. When that moment passed, the convoy shut down and other systems took over. What lessons does the Red Ball Express offer today? First, that innovation often arises from crisis rather than planning. No manual at Fort Leavenworth proposed painting French signposts with red circles. Necessity birthed creativity. Second, that supply lines require as much courage as assault lines. For every commando raid, there must be hundreds of unsung drivers willing to brave fatigue, weather, and enemy fire to deliver beans, bullets, and band-aids. Third, that diversity is an asset when leadership recognizes it. In a segregated army, black truckers delivered miracles because they were finally given a chance to do so. Fourth, that technology alone cannot win wars. The German army had advanced tanks, but not the logistics to keep them fueled. Fifth, that showing abundance can be a strategic tool. Convoys with headlights blazing carried an implicit psychological message to friend and foe alike. These insights are not relics of 1944. Modern militaries still grapple with contested supply lines, just-in-time inventories, and brittle transportation networks. The Red Ball story urges leaders to invest in redundancy, inclusivity, and imagination. We must honor their road,